Ethan Carter had never been one for the suburban sprawl or cookie-cutter communities springing up all around the country. He preferred the quiet of nature, the hum of insects, the rustle of trees in the wind. When his grandfather passed away and left him a sizable plot of land just outside of Oak Ridge, Ethan saw it as both a gift and a legacy one he intended to protect. The land stretched across forested hills, rocky ridges, and a narrow valley that dipped down toward a small lake fed by an old dam. His grandfather had been meticulous about the property's boundaries, and Ethan had always admired that same attention to detail. One summer afternoon, Ethan set out to inspect the southern ridge of the property, where his land bordered a newly constructed neighborhood. With a faded map in hand and a GPS survey app on his phone, he began walking the marked property lines, double-checking the coordinates against the legal descriptions passed down with the deed. It was then that he noticed something strange. The southernmost corner of the land clearly marked as his now bore a cul-de-sac, complete with freshly poured sidewalks, a welcome sign, and 5 newly built homes that looked identical to one another. Further down the ridge, more houses were visible, some still under construction. Confused, Ethan walked closer. A contractor glanced at him briefly, but said nothing, returning to his task. At first, Ethan thought it might be a mistake perhaps. He had misread the map or confused his grandfather's notes. But as he triangulated points from the ridge, the creek, and the old oak tree that had always been used as a marker, it became irrefutably clear. The development had bled across the property line by several hundred feet. That night, Ethan pulled out every document he had. His grandfather's land surveys, satellite imagery, county deeds, and a dusty box labeled water rights. He spent hours studying the old topographic maps, which confirmed it again and again. The homes were sitting on land that wasn't theirs. It wasn't even a close call. This wasn't a fence being a few inches off. This was over 10 acres of his property being absorbed by an aggressive HOA development that had never once contacted him. He tried to remain calm. Mistakes happened. Perhaps the developers simply used outdated plats. But the deeper Ethan dug, the more it seemed intentional. The construction permits on file didn't include parcel numbers matching his property. No one had applied for easements or right-of-way access. It was as if his land had simply been erased from the plan. The next day, he drove into the HOA office, a sleek, glass-walled building that seemed too polished for its rural surroundings. The receptionist gave him a blank look when he asked to speak to someone in charge. After a 20-minute wait, he was ushered into a conference room where a man named Bradley Knox, the HOA president, met him with a condescending smile and a clipboard. Ethan laid out his concerns, showed his paperwork, and calmly asked for an explanation. Knox didn't even look at the documents. He leaned back in his chair and smirked. That land was vacant and unused for decades, Knox said. We filed our permits with the county. If you've got a problem, I suggest you take it up with them. But it's my land, Ethan replied. This isn't just a clerical issue. You're building on private property that belongs to me. Knox shrugged. Well, that's not how our surveyor saw it. If you want to pay a liar thousands of dollars to fight us, be my guest. Good luck. We've got more homes going up next month. Ethan walked out of the office stunned, angry, and with a burning clarity he hadn't felt in years. He looked out over the manicured lawns and pastel-colored houses creeping deeper into his land. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Weeks passed, and the situation only grew worse. What started with 5 houses had quickly ballooned into 15. Ethan watched from his ridge as the HOA has hired construction crews laid down asphalt roads, installed streetlights, and dug out basements, all on land that legally belonged to him. They weren't just building homes. They were creating an entire neighborhood, and it was spreading like a virus across the southern stretch of his property. Ethan tried, once again, to go through the official channels. He filed complaints with the county office, but their response was tepid at best. The clerk told him they'd look into it, but after 2 weeks of silence, Ethan began to suspect that the HOA had some kind of pull at the local level. After all, money flowed in from these new developments, and tax revenue was a powerful incentive to look the other way. He called a land use attorney in the city, and after a brief consultation, he got his answer: yes, Ethan had the legal right to the land. Yes, the homes were being built illegally. But filing a lawsuit could take years, and the HOA's team of lawyers would drag out the process, hoping Ethan would either give up or settle. It was infuriating. He wasn't rich. He couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle. And every day that passed, another house rose on his property. Trucks rumbled across the gravel paths his grandfather once used to hike. Children played where deer used to graze. A basketball hoop was bolted into a tree stump he remembered sitting on as a boy. They were erasing him from his own land. It wasn't just the construction either. The residents who had already moved in seemed to believe the land was theirs by right. One evening, as Ethan walked the tree line to check boundary markers, a woman with a golden retriever accused him of trespassing. She threatened to call the police. Another time, a man mowing his lawn waved Ethan away with an annoyed gesture, saying, "This ain't your land, old-timer." The sense of entitlement was staggering. They had built their lives on stolen ground, and now they had the audacity to act as if he was the intruder. Then came the letter, a formal notice from the HOA, complete with their embossed logo, informing him that his frequent and disruptive presence near residential properties was causing concern among community members. It demanded that he cease unauthorized access to the area on his own land. Ethan laughed out loud when he read it, but the laughter quickly turned bitter. It was a warning shot, one designed to intimidate him into staying away. Ethan pinned the letter to the corkboard in his cabin, right next to the deed, and sat back in his creaky wooden chair. He was no fool. He knew this wouldn't be solved by arguing with HOA board members or filing county complaints. These people operated like a machine, one that bulldozed anything in its path and left no room for negotiation. But machines had weaknesses, pressure points. All it took was knowing where to push. He remembered something his grandfather once told him. While teaching him how to track, the land always remembers. People forget boundaries. Water never does. It echoed in his mind now like a distant bell. That's when he looked out toward the old lake, its water still and glinting beneath the sunset, and a thought began to form, slow but certain. The HOA had stolen his land without permission, built homes without title, and now dared to threaten him for walking where he had every legal right to be. They thought they had won, but they had no idea what was coming. The path to the dam was overgrown with brush and tall grass, the way almost forgotten except to Ethan, who had walked it 100 times in his youth. The further he ventured, the quieter the world became. No hammering, no shouting construction. Workers, no whining engines, just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl claiming the twilight. It was here, nestled deep in a low valley beyond the reach of any suburban sprawl, that the old dam stood. His grandfather had built it himself decades ago, with help from a few local hands and knowledge passed down through generations. It wasn't massive, but it was smartly constructed. Reinforced stone walls lined with dense clay, an adjustable sluice gate, and most importantly, a natural choke point in the valley that allowed the dam to hold back water from 3 small feeder streams. Over time, it had created a shimmering, crescent-shaped lake that had served as a personal sanctuary for their family. Ethan hadn't visited it in months. Life had been too busy dealing with attorneys, surveys, and the slow invasion of the HOA. Now, as he stood before it once more, memories came rushing back, his grandfather teaching him how to fish. Off the dock, the splash of skipping stones, the way the frogs croaked in chorus at dusk. But those warm recollections quickly gave way to calculation. The dam was more than a relic. It was power, control, and control was something Ethan desperately needed to regain. He walked along the dam's edge, inspecting it carefully. Structurally, it was still sound. The sluice gate, rusted and stiff from years of neglect, groaned when he tested the wheel, but it moved. A surge of water gurgled through the narrow channel as he opened it a fraction, and he watched the stream wend its way downhill, exactly where he knew it would go. Back when the land was wild and undeveloped, the runoff would simply feed into a marshy plain that absorbed the excess. But the HOA had changed that. Their development was built directly downhill, on the flattened floodplain Ethan's grandfather had always warned about disturbing. It was convenient, scenic, and perilous, especially during heavy rains. The earth down there was loose and soft. All the grading, paving, and digging had disrupted the natural drainage. They hadn't even built proper storm channels. Ethan studied the topographic maps again later that night. His suspicions were confirmed. If the dam released enough water, during a rainy spell, even a minor one, the runoff would surge straight into the development. Not enough to destroy everything, but enough to flood basements, erode foundations, ruin landscaping, and force the HOA to reckon with the reality of their trespass. And the best part? He didn't have to destroy anything. He didn't need dynamite or sabotage. All he had to do was restore the dam to what it was built to do, manage natural water flow through his land. He wouldn't even have to open the gates all the way, just enough to make a point. But Ethan wasn't rash. He spent the next few days clearing the dam's control path, oiling the gears, and cleaning debris. He installed a motion-sensitive camera nearby to monitor activity and documented every step with meticulous notes and photos. He even checked with the local water board, confirming that the dam was still listed as a private agricultural water structure. That meant it was exempt from municipal oversight as long as he wasn't redirecting it beyond his own land. In the eyes of the law, Ethan was simply a private landowner maintaining an old dam on his grandfather's property. But in his heart, he knew it was more than that. This was about balance. The HOA had poured concrete over his legacy, ignored boundaries, mocked his rights, and assumed they'd never be held accountable. Ethan smiled to himself as he looked out across the water. The lake was still, silent, waiting, and soon it would speak. The rain came earlier than expected. A slow drizzle at first. It soon thickened into a steady downpour that soaked the valley in gray and turned the sky into a swirling sheet of steel. For days, the clouds lingered, emptying their weight across the ridge, swelling the creeks and feeding the lake behind Ethan's dam. The water level rose inch by inch, lapping at the moss-covered rocks with growing urgency. Ethan watched from his cabin window, a quiet calm about him, like a farmer who had spent weeks tilling the soil and now stood waiting for the harvest. He had given the HOA more than enough chances. He had tried civility, diplomacy, even legal channels. They laughed. They built more homes. Just a week ago, he found a utility truck trenching a fiber line directly across his boundary. The crew chief had the gall to tell him, "It's public. Access now," as if ownership had magically vanished because they said so. Ethan had said nothing. He simply turned, walked away, and drove back to the dam. That night, under cover of darkness and with the rain still whispering through the trees, Ethan hiked to the dam with a flashlight and an old wrench slung through his belt. He moved deliberately, not out of haste or anger, but with the practiced purpose of someone executing a plan he had thought through to the final detail. The dam's gate wheel was slick, the metal cold and stiff, but he gripped it firmly and began to turn, slowly, deliberately. The sluice creaked open, and water began to flow, not violently, not in a raging torrent, but with a building strength that could not be stopped. The lake responded like a sleeping beast stirred from slumber. The water surged through the gate and spilled down the natural channel Ethan had carefully cleared over the past week. Rain joined the flow, magnifying its momentum. The creek swelled as it snaked downhill, winding through brush and undergrowth before slipping past the edge of the tree line and into the development. By morning, the damage was undeniable. The lower cul-de-sac, once a centerpiece of the HOA's marketing brochures, was submerged under 6 inches of muddy runoff. Lawns were waterlogged, mulch floated in swirling pools, and brand-new basements were filled with ankle-deep water. Homeowners stepped outside in robes and boots, shocked and shouting. One man was on his knees, frantically scooping water from his garage with a bucket. A little girl stood near her driveway in disbelief as her bicycle floated gently away. Construction halted immediately. Work crews, faced with flooded foundations and collapsed trenches, packed up and left. Heavy equipment sat unused, half submerged, and caked in mud. The HOA president, Bradley Knox, arrived mid-morning in a gleaming SUV, only to find the entrance to his prized development turned into a swamp. He waded into the flood in loafers, barking into his phone, trying to reach insurance agents, engineers, anyone who could explain why his perfect neighborhood was falling apart. Ethan stood just within the tree line, out of sight, but not out of reach. He watched it all from a distance with binoculars. Not with joy, this wasn't vengeance. Not exactly, but with the satisfaction of someone who had been underestimated for too long. They had trespassed. They had built illegally. And now nature, aided by a careful hand, was reclaiming what it was owed. Later that afternoon, Ethan received a call from an unfamiliar number. He let it go to voicemail. Knox's voice played back, clipped and breathless, offering to discuss a resolution. Ethan didn't return the call. He simply walked back to the dam, turned the wheel just slightly tighter, and let the water flow at a steady, legal, and unstoppable pace. The aftermath unfolded like a slow-motion implosion. Over the course of the next week, the upscale dream neighborhood the HOA had poured millions into became a cautionary tale splashed across headlines and local news segments. Reporters interviewed furious homeowners standing ankle-deep in their soggy living rooms. Video footage circulated online showing landscapers trying desperately to pump out flooded lawns, only for more water to rise overnight. People wanted answers, and the answers they got only made things worse for the HOA. At least Ethan never said a word publicly. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. When the city engineers arrived to assess the damage, they followed the runoff trail upstream. Their inspection revealed no broken pipes, no sabotage, no mysterious mechanical failure. What they found instead was a perfectly legal, decades-old agricultural dam built on private property, operating within its permitted boundaries. The water hadn't come from some criminal act. It had come from mismanagement by the HOA, who had bulldozed natural floodplains and built homes where no one should have. The HOA's president, Bradley Knox, tried to spin the story. He blamed unprecedented rainfall, topographic anomalies, and failure of upstream water retention, but the truth was impossible to dodge. Permits for construction didn't match the county land records. The parcel boundaries had been ignored. Worse, several homes were discovered to be sitting entirely on land still legally registered to Ethan Carter. Homeowners were furious. Their multi-$100,000 investments were now liabilities. They couldn't sell. They couldn't insure, and they couldn't even live comfortably in their new houses. Mold crept into drywall. Foundations began to shift. Lawsuits came flooding in from every direction, against the HOA, against the builders, against the real estate agents. Everyone was pointing fingers, but all roads led back to the same fatal mistake building where they had no right to. Knox resigned 3 days later. His smug public confidence evaporated the moment he was served with a subpoena. Rumors circulated that he'd tried to flee liability by shifting assets, but it was too late. The HOA board disbanded soon after, its members either distancing themselves or lawyering up. The neighborhood's once pristine entrance sign was defaced with black spray paint that read "Thieves." Through all of it, Ethan stayed quiet. His lawyer handled the paperwork. When questioned by investigators, he provided a full packet of documentation: original land surveys, legal boundaries, photos of trespassing construction crews, even the ignored notice letters he'd sent to the HOA months earlier. The evidence was so complete that the county was forced to acknowledge its oversight. Ethan was even offered a quiet settlement, but he refused the money. He wanted his land back, not a check. One by one, the flooded homes emptied. Some families left in a hurry, others lingered, hoping for a miracle that never came. The HOA's accounts were frozen pending litigation. Insurance companies denied nearly every claim, citing unauthorized construction on disputed land. Eventually, banks began foreclosure proceedings. The neighborhood that was supposed to be a shining example of modern suburban planning was now a ghost town. Littered with for sale signs no one would ever answer. Online, the story caught fire. Ethan became a folk hero to anyone who had ever clashed with an overreaching HOA. Social media lit up with memes, interviews, even a podcast episode titled "The Man Who Flooded the HOA and Won." Strangers sent him messages of support, cheering his quiet stand against entitled developers. But Ethan didn't bask in the attention. He spent most days back by the lake, tending the dam, planting native grasses along the bank, and restoring the trails his grandfather once walked. He wasn't interested in revenge. What he'd done wasn't about payback, it was about restoring balance, enforcing boundaries, and reminding people that you can't just take what isn't yours. Justice, like water, always finds its level. Spring arrived quietly that year, and with it, a kind of peace Ethan hadn't felt in a long time. The valley was greener than it had been in years, the land finally free of bulldozers and trespassers. The only sounds now were birdsong, the soft splash of fish in the lake, and the breeze rustling through trees that had once stood at the edge of a construction zone. The chaos was over. The land had been reclaimed, not just legally, but spiritually. It was his again, in every sense of the word. The ruined homes were eventually condemned and demolished. With no HOA to fund repairs and no buyers willing to invest in a lawsuit-laden flood zone, the county declared the area unsafe. Ethan didn't celebrate their downfall, but he didn't mourn it either. They were scars, ugly reminders of arrogance and greed, and it felt right to see them removed. What replaced them was better. With the help of a small local conservation group, Ethan began the slow process of restoring the damaged areas to their natural state. The group offered grants and volunteers to plant native trees, rebuild creek beds, and protect wildlife habitats. What had once been paved cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns became open meadows, wetlands, and forested buffers. Birds returned. So did deer. Even a family of foxes took up residence near the southern edge of the property. Nature had a way of healing when given the chance. Ethan built a small cabin near the lake, modern in its essentials but simple in its design. Solar panels powered the lights, Rainwater collectors fed the plumbing, and a small wood stove kept the place warm through winter. He kept no television, no internet. Just books, a radio, and a porch that overlooked the lake. From there, he could see the spot where the old HOA houses once stood, now covered in wildflowers and young saplings. He thought often about his grandfather, what he would have thought about the battle, about the dam, about everything. Ethan believed the old man would have approved. His grandfather had taught him the importance of boundaries, not just on maps, but in life. What you own, what you protect, what you stand for. Those things mattered. They always had. From time to time, people still came. Not the angry kind anymore, but curious visitors. Hikers, conservationists, even a few documentary filmmakers who wanted to interview the man who flooded the HOA. Ethan declined most of them. He didn't want fame. He didn't need his face on some screen. He had his land, his lake, and his solitude, and that was more than enough. A letter did arrive one day, though, that made him pause. It was from a family who had once owned one of the homes built illegally on his property. They had lost everything, the letter said, but after reading the full story in the news and seeing how it all unfolded, they realized they had been lied to. They apologized for how they had treated him, for not asking questions, for assuming. He was the villain. They ended the letter with a line that stuck with him. Sometimes the land has to remind us who it belongs to. Ethan folded the letter and tucked it into a small wooden box he kept by the fireplace. He didn't reply, but he smiled. They were right. The lake was full again. The dam stood strong, water trickling through in a steady, controlled flow. Wild geese paddled across its surface, and the trees along the ridge swayed gently in the wind. Ethan sat on his porch, coffee in hand, boots kicked up, watching the clouds drift across the sky. He had defended what was his. He had waited, planned, and acted with purpose. And in the end, he hadn't just restored the land, he had restored himself.